Hello, everybody. Welcome back for Brihat Samhita. Today we're going to look at what Varahamihira has to say about eclipses. We're still in, I think it's chapter 5. Yeah, we're still in chapter 5, where he's discussing Rahu, and he has given a purely astronomical explanation of what Rahu is. It's where the moon's path intersects the sun's path, and he puts the mythology, let's call it, of Rahu being a headless asura, etc., in perspective. That at this point where the moon crosses the sun's path is named after Rahu, and Rahu is empowered by the eclipse that happens in that point, and it should be worshipped on the eclipse when the moon gets to that point. Now, he's going to talk about eclipses. So some of the things, let's get started and look at some of the things that he says. He says it's wrong. So now he's going to deal with two misconceptions that were prevalent at his time. One misconception was that it's not really an eclipse unless all the planets line up. So in other words, sun and moon are there for an eclipse always, right? And sun and moon, but also the other 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. There was some opinion apparently at that time that a true eclipse is only when all 5 of them are within some orb of Rahu. He says that's wrong. It's an eclipse even without that. He also says it's wrong. There was apparently a theory that if you wanted to know about an eclipse that's coming, then you put a drop of oil on water on the half moon approaching the eclipse. And the way the oil looks on the water will tell you the way the eclipse is going to be. So he says that's wrong. And I don't know why he just mentions these two things out of the blue. Maybe these were two prevalent concepts at the time that he was writing, or maybe it seems that one is overly scrupulous and one is overly superstitious. So he might be making an interesting statement that it's wrong to be overly scrupulous or overly superstitious about the eclipse. The eclipse is a astronomical phenomenon when the sun and moon align along with their nodes where the moon crosses, where their orbits cross. Okay, then in the next text, which is 18th, he tells you, instead of using this drop of oil, what you can do. And he says he's not going to talk about it in this book because he's already described it more in his Panchasiddhantikas. So he says, and it's okay, let's try to boil down what he says. He says, if you want to tell the magnitude of the solar eclipse, so as you know, solar eclipses are not always total. It's a partial solar eclipse. Lunar eclipses also are not always total. Sometimes they're penumbral, which means the moon just gets red. It just gets the outside of the shadow, the edge of the shadow. So he says, if you want to tell the magnitude of the eclipse, specifically for solar eclipse, then look at the moon's parallax and latitude. And the points of the commencement and termination of the eclipses are determined by the means of both parallax and angles. The time of commencement and termination of the eclipse by the means of the time of the new moon. The details of this process are given in my astronomy book, which is the Panchasiddhantika. So he's got some astronomical way that you can tell, and it's based on how exactly the moon is going to be on the nodal point. How exactly the moon is going to be in front of the sun. All right, now we're going to get now from 19, I believe, into some more of the prediction stuff. So he's going to give you a text to set up. He's going to give you some information about this little system of interpretation that he's going to give. He says that there are different gods that rule over different periods of time. Let me see what he says. Brahma is the lord of the new and full moon periods of the first 6 months. Okay, this is something interesting. You get 6-month periods, and each one has a different lord of the new and full moon. The first 6 months is Brahma. The next 6 months is who? The moon, Chandra. Brahma is the lord of the first 6 months, the lord of the new and full moon for the first 6 months. Then Chandra, then Indra, then Kuvera, then Varuna, then Agni, and then Yama. And then it repeats. So there's 7. So there's 7 gods that will be in charge of the new and full moon in a cycle of 6 months. Now, where does the cycle start from? Supposedly from the beginning of time. So I don't know how you calculate this, but I'm sure Varahamihira probably explains it in his astronomy texts. But what he's going to say is depending upon the god who is ruling the full moon and new moon, because remember, you can only have an eclipse at a full moon or a new moon. So depending on the god that's ruling the full moon or the new moon, you get different effects. If the eclipse happens when Brahma is ruling, then it's nice. So look, this is just an important point. Even if we can't figure out any of these details that he's talking about, here's one really important detail. Everybody, especially in India, gets really upset about eclipses and thinks that eclipses are nothing but bad news. But here is one obvious thing, is that Varahamihira is saying that eclipses sometimes are good news. If Brahma is the lord of the new moon and it's eclipsed, let me make sure of this. Yeah, if Brahma is the lord of the moon during the eclipse, then you get good effects. So there you go. So it's not every eclipse should produce a bad effect, like an earthquake, a disaster, etc. If Chandra is the Lord, then you get prosperity to merchants, but not prosperity to the intellectuals. If Brahma is the Lord, you get prosperity to merchants and intellectuals and everybody. If Indra is the Lord, you get war. And you get, as the result, the harvest is poor. So if there's an eclipse when Indra is the Lord of the moon. If Kuvera is the Lord of the moon and there's an eclipse, the capitalists, like the rich people, like Kuvera, they suffer. But the farms and fields don't suffer too much, so people in general don't suffer too much. If Varuna is the Lord, only the royalty suffers. Everybody else is happy. Agni? If Agni is the Lord, then you get everything is good. Everything is good. So if it's Agni or Brahma, everything is good for everybody. If it's Indra, everything's bad, basically. There's war. If it's Moon, Kuvera, or if it's Moon Kuvera or Varuna, then some particular type of person suffers only. If Agni is the Lord, there's good crops, good health, freedom from fear, and abundance of water, rain. If Yama is the Lord, there's terrible. It's terrible. So it's the worst one. If Brahma is the Lord, it's the best one. And if Yama is the Lord of the moon when it's eclipsed, it's the worst one. If Yama is the Lord, then there's going to be droughts, famines, total blight of crops. And then the upcoming period of time, you get a lot of problems. I wonder who was the Lord of the moon in the eclipse that was in December. That would be a nice thing to figure out. Got a feeling that it was Yama. If the eclipses should occur before the calculated times. So now he's going to talk about eclipses. Now let me see what this footnote is. So the footnote is just that this is an example of an omen where something is utpata, which means just unusual, out of place. Let me see, somebody has a comment here that it seems interesting. Isn't he talking about nakshatra wheel calendar for each month of the year? Nope. He's just talking about, not that I can't see that. How do you calculate the Lord of the Moon? I don't know how to calculate it, because I don't know how Varahamihira is figuring the beginning of creation. So he just says every 6 months it changes since the beginning of creation. And it's not even clear whose 6 months he's talking about. But he's probably talking about regular human 6 months. The reason why he's probably talking about regular human 6 months is you get eclipses on a 6-month cycle. Maybe it's from the beginning of a particular yuga, not like Kali Yuga or something. I don't know. You need researchers. I'm just presenting this text and we're talking about it. You need some scientific researchers to figure out the calculations. So then he says, if you get an eclipse that occurs a little sooner than you think it should have, then it's worse. And if you get an eclipse that occurs a little after you think, it's also bad. So it should be, the eclipse should be on schedule, as for most things, right? That's the basis of omen. Now, he ends this discussion, and he says, I described above the effects of the occurrence of eclipse before or after, in accordance with the ancient Shastras, but the calculation of a really learned astronomer will at no time fail. So he's saying that's kind of only in the old days. He's interesting. He's giving a commentary on his statement. In 24, he's saying, what I've just said here about if an eclipse should occur before it should happen or after it should happen, then it's going to be bad. He said this is what people used to do in the old days when they didn't. These days we calculate the eclipse so accurately that it never comes before or after we think. Now, look at what he says here. If there should be both lunar and solar eclipses in 1 month, princes will suffer from dissensions among their own armies and from wars. So this is actually a quote from Mahabharata. And it's not just 1 month. It's in the Vedic calendar. In our calendar, we have leap years where we add a day. And in general, we're adding days all the time. We have months with 31 days, a lot. Every other month has got 31 days. So we're constantly adding little bits of time to keep the solar and lunar calendars in sync. In the Vedic times, they just kept the months simple, 30 days, to match the moon's cycle. But because the moon would get out of sync with the sun cycle, instead of solving it the way we do now, just adding a little bit all the time, they would add a lot all at once. So every few years they would have this whole nother 14-day period. And then that was called, what was that called? Adhik Masa. So the extra month. Now, if you can get 2 eclipses, first it's going to be unusual if you can get 1 eclipse in that month, just because it's where will the eclipse fall? If you can get 2 eclipses on that exact small 14-day, you just have to nail both ends of the month to get that. It's not a good time to war because your army will revolt. And actually, the commentator here says this statement about the eclipses in the extra month was stated by Vyas in Mahabharata. And he said that this actually happened. There was 2 eclipses in that extra month when somebody was trying to convince Duryodhana not to go to war with the Pandavas because this had happened. Krishna was born in the waning moon, half moon. Nobody said anything about waning or waxing. So just stick to the text. Try to learn the text. If the eclipses should occur at rising or setting, this is interesting. If you get an eclipse, which is also the rising sun, this was Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was born with the eclipse rising. Right? He was born at sunset, I believe, with the eclipse rising. If the eclipse should occur at rising or setting, the crops in the harvest season are going to perish and the princes are going to suffer. If in total eclipses, if the eclipsed sun or moon should be subject to malefic planetary influence, there'll be death and famine in the land. Now, this was the case. I would argue that this was the case in the coronavirus eclipse, which is the eclipse at the end of December, because Jupiter was debilitated there. So I would argue that they were affected. There was a Jupiter debilitated in the eclipse, within the degree of orb of the eclipse. If the sun and moon should begin to be eclipsed when only half risen, deceitful men will suffer. If they should be eclipsed when in the first section of the firmament, those that live by fire and virtuous Brahmins will suffer. So if they're eclipsed in the early morning, then the morning-y type of people suffer. Those are like priests and teachers. If they should be eclipsed in the second section of the sky, then heretics, merchants, kshatriyas, the powerful people suffer. If there's eclipsed in the third section, which I think is towards the west, then you get shudras, mlechas, people that serve other people suffer. If they're eclipsed in the midhaven, which means at the pole of the sky, I see we need to end this. How many more texts we got? Quite a few. If they're eclipsed at the pole of the sky, then the central provinces suffer. If they're in the fifth section, then the peaceful animals, ministers, and household inmates will suffer. All right, so you see there's different ways of interpreting who's going to suffer. So it's not that everybody suffers when there's an eclipse. This is what we learned today. It's not, whoa. Oh, look at this 30-second text. I don't know, but 30-second text says that it's important to note if an eclipse happens at the Uttarayana, which is the southern solstice, or the Dakshinaya, which is the northern solstice. And that is also the coronavirus eclipse. The coronavirus eclipse happened at the southern solstice, which is Uttarayana. He said, so apparently that's a more significant eclipse. So I think we got 2 counts so far of the eclipse that occurred when the coronavirus became an epidemic. It was the first count is that there was a malefic influence, which is the debilitated Jupiter, and the second, there may be more, I don't have the whole chart memorized, and the second was that it was on Uttarayana. It was December 23rd or something. So it was very close to Uttarayana. Okay, so I think what to take away from this is that not every eclipse is the same. And not every eclipse causes problems for everybody. Some eclipses do cause problems for everybody. Some eclipses cause good things for everybody. Some eclipses don't harm some people, only harm others. This is what he's been saying. So we'll pick up again with this subject tomorrow. That December 26th. Just very close to Uttarayana. Okay, so we'll pick up with this again tomorrow. And now I'm going to swap over to the Bhagavatam stream, so I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.